Welcome, guys. I'm recording this video in an intent to use my voice more. I've been writing a lot lately, have a lot of ideas flowing, but haven't fully been able to step into actually recording them in video form, in audio form. So that's what's happening right now. I'm out here in a community garden by my house, and today I want to talk about a couple topics that I think you will find useful, a couple frameworks, a couple lenses on the topic of dissatisfaction. So I've been sitting with this inquiry into the nature of dissatisfaction lately, and there are a couple lenses that I want to share that I think would be useful for you on how to relate to dissatisfaction in a more generative way. And so the first lens is becoming curious about the nature of that dissatisfaction and getting curious as to what is giving rise to the experience in the first place. And so the process goes something like this. You notice the feeling of dissatisfaction. You notice all of these stories that you have about why you feel dissatisfied. You drop the stories and then you experience the sensations of the dissatisfaction. And then you also realize that getting to the sensation level is still not uncovering the root cause. And so then you sit and you contemplate, what is it that is at the root of this dissatisfaction? You sit with it and you sit with it and you sit with it, and you really sense as deeply as you can using your experiential, using more than just experiencing sensations, but really like with as much depth as you can, you sense into what is it that is giving rise to this dissatisfaction. And that is the whole practice. And so one teacher that I listened to, Daniel Ingram, his take is that at the root of all dissatisfaction is generating a self, is the process of generating a self. And so the inquiry here that I'm beckoning you to do is to notice the ways in which having a self function all the time, having all these stories about who you are, what you're doing, how you're relating to other people, all of these ways that the self is continuing its identification as a self is the very thing that causes the dissatisfaction to arise. That is one lens that we can look at this experience of suffering from or dissatisfaction. I'm using these words interchangeably. The second frame is to notice how this experience of dissatisfaction is causing us to act and show up in the world, and noticing how our freedom in life, our agency is being limited by the current way that we're relating to this dissatisfaction and suffering. And so the question here is, how am I relating to the dissatisfaction? Am I pushing it away or am I pulling it towards me? And these, I would argue, are equally as bad, although will have different manifestations. They will show up in different ways. And so the interesting inquiry here is to notice that, first of all, when we instantly reject the experience of suffering, we tell ourselves that it's not okay to experience this suffering. And therefore, so much of our psychological energy, our mental energy, is being used up in the process of trying to get away from the suffering. And it's actually very, very draining. We're left feeling very drained, very apathetic, depressed, even. And so, the what I would propose here is to notice how when we reject the suffering, it decreases our freedom because the only choice that we have in response to the suffering is rejection. But the same goes with um, grasping on and attaching to the suffering is equally as it equally produces just as much dissatisfaction at the end. And so the other side of things is the sort of in the personal development sphere, this sort of belief that suffering is a way to improve, and without feeling pain, that we're not improving, which I would say is also utterly ungrounded. So you can see this show up in a lot of circles that talk about how the only way to make a better life is to move through the pain and the suffering and the dissatisfaction and to do the thing anyway, which is on the surface a very good idea. Yes, you want to learn how to show up for yourself no matter what you're feeling. But then there's also a deeper layer of when you get in this mindset for too long, there's an attachment to suffering that develops where if you stop suffering, yet continue progressing, the belief tells you that you're no longer progressing because you're not experiencing pain and suffering. And so you associate the pain and the suffering with growth rather than noticing that sometimes in trying to transcend our current limitations, there is pain and suffering, but that is not an inherent quality in the developmental process. And so, what I would beckon you to recognize is how even attaching onto suffering is still a form of dissatisfaction, or is still something that generates more dissatisfaction. And in order for the dissatisfaction to feather out, for there to be more acceptance, equanimity, and ease in our life, we need to notice that we can actually continue to show up for the things that excite us, that move the needle without there being suffering. And whether or not there's suffering is irrelevant. And what is relevant has nothing to do with how much pain we're experiencing. And so, therefore, we can actually do things that support our well being in a way that is easeful, that does not generate more suffering than it needs to. And so, in this case, it would be like getting off of the duality of attaching to suffering or rejecting suffering and seeing suffering clearly, and seeing that the experience of suffering is just an experience that can be witnessed and seen and fully understood in its entirety, and that the attachment and the rejection of the suffering is just our not wanting to sit with it and see it clearly, because it intensifies it, at least for a shorter period of time, before we actually pierce it and see it with greater clarity. And so what I'm inquiring into is, what would it look like to perceive the suffering clearly and to relate to it in a way where we're not generating more of it? We can see that we can take actions without there being extra suffering. So a very easy example is my personal experience. I've been choosing to be more active. And in my choice to be more active and to go do physically exhaustive exercises, sometimes I have this feeling that if I'm not like in a state of pain and suffering, that I'm not doing it right. But I also notice that, I mean, sometimes I can go and do physically exhaustive stuff and it can be done with such a level of ease that it's quite enjoyable. And the fact that I'm not suffering while I'm doing it is not a marker that I'm doing it wrong, but just that I'm not relating to it in a way that is generating suffering, because I have this belief that suffering equals growth. So if I can drop this belief that suffering equals growth, then I can relate to difficult tasks in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary dissatisfaction. So these are a couple frames to play around with, see if they can help you relate to your experience differently. I appreciate you listening. Have a good rest of your day.